Hey guys, it is Arickamisha. Thank you so much for clicking on today's video. I think it's time for you to change. Let me read my notes. I know it's hard for us to take a look at ourselves and face the truth that we need to make changes in our lives, in ourselves. God was talking to me and he was saying, you keep asking me to change them, but it's really you that need to change. I think it's time for you to change. That's what God said to me. Clear as day. And isn't that the truth? I am here sharing what God talks to me about, and I pray that it may help someone. I'm here telling my business, praying that it may help you with your business. Yeah. God got me telling my business, and I pray that it helps you with your business. God got me telling my business, so it'll help you with your business. All of that. Yeah. But yes, God was talking to me because I was talking to God. Y'all know I'm always talking to God. Like I'm always going to God. I get on God's nerves. I know I do. But yeah, I was talking to God about something, and I was saying, God, I was saying to God, I was like, God, you know, like they get on my nerves. I'm just keeping it real. Something had aggravated me and somebody had got on my nerves. Yes. Being honest. And I was like, God, you know, like God, I was going to God with it. I was like, God, you know, they got on my nerves, you know, just venting to God. Y'all know how we do. And God said, I think it's time for you to change. And I was like, oh God, they need to do better. And God was like, no. God said, I think you need to change. I think it's time for you to change. And I was like, what, God, me? And God said, yes. God said, I think it's time for you to change. And I was like, God, well, what I did? Well, how I got from them to me? Just me talking to God. And I'm telling y'all, I be talking to God just like this. Talking to God just like that. God be talking to me just like that. God don't be using these big words that I can't understand and I don't know the definition of. God talked to me on my level. And God said to me, God said, I think it's time for you to change. It's what God wanted me to come and talk about today. A lot of times we want people to change. We want people to do better. We want people to do this. And a lot of times it's us that need to change. God wants us to change how we look at things. God wants us to look at how we respond to things. God wants us to look at what gets to us and what aggravates us. And God wants us to change all of that so that when things happen, they don't affect you at all. And God said, if you change your spirit, change your mindset, God said the situation, you would look at the situation totally different. God said the situation wouldn't even bother you if you looked at it from a different perspective. And isn't that so hard? Because I was like, God, what perspective you want me to look? You know how they is. And God's like, yeah, I know how they is. God said, I know how you are too. God said, if you change your spirit, change your perspective, God said, I think it's time for you to change. I said, well, what? Time for me to, once again, God, how did it become about me when I'm coming to you about them? I'm telling y'all. I said, God, how did it become about me when I'm coming to you about them? God said, I think it's time for you to change. And God wanted me to come and talk about it today. God said, I think it's time for you to change. You may have gone to God with things. You may have asked God, you know, God, they need to do better and change them, God, and make them better. And God is saying, I think it's time for you to change. It's what God wanted me to come and talk about today. God said, I think it's time for you to change. So, that's what he said. So, I said, God, you sure it's me? And you know what? It's not that God is blaming us. It's not that God is blaming us and God saying, we wrong. Because sometimes we could be wrong now. And you know what? Sometimes we need to change. We do need to change. Because a lot of times we think it's them, but it's really us. Just saying now. Now y'all know that's true too. But God was telling me, God was like, you need to change. God said, I think it's time for you to change. God said, you coming to me about this and this. God said, I think you need to change. God said, you change your spirit, change your perspective. God said, and things will be better. So that's what God told me, y'all. God said, I think it's time for you to change. And so God wanted me to come and talk about today. God said, I think it's time for you to change. And you know, I don't know what's going on in your life. I don't know what's going on. But God said, I think it's time for you to change. You know, change your perspective. And you know what, too? Now, God just dropped it in my spirit now. A lot of times, we may think the other person is the issue. We could very well be the issue. Because I know, personally, spiritually, a lot of times I was the issue. Took me years to admit that. A lot of times, I was the issue. Yes, I say it proudly and humbly. A lot of times I was the issue. And that's what God was saying to me back then too. God said, you want them to change. God said, but you need to change. God said, you want them to do better. God said, no. You need to do better. You need to do better. I think it's time for you to change. God sent me here to say, I think it's time for you to change. You know what that is. You know. I'm just a messenger. God told me. So I'm telling you. God got on me, so I'm getting on you. But yeah, that's what God was talking to me about. I think it's time for you to change. I think it's time for you to change, God said to me. God said, I think it's time for you to change. God said, because I'm tired of you coming to me about this over and over. God said, no. God said, no. I think it's time for you to change. And I was like, but God, am I wrong? God, am I wrong? God said, I'm not saying that you're wrong. God said, but I'm telling you, as my child, God said, I'm telling you, you got to change. Change your perspective. Change your spirit. Change how you viewing this thing. God said, look at it from this perspective. Look at it this way. And I said, okay, God, you right. You right, God. You is right. Hey, God always right. I am not gonna argue with God because I know God is always right, honey. I ain't no fool. It's what God wanted me to come and talk about today. I think it's time for you to change. All right, guys.